I don't want to close my eyes. I don't want to fall asleep 'cause I miss you, baby. And I don't want to miss a thing. That song was all over the radio when I was living my best 8th grade years. It was the summer of 1998, and that was blasting in my car and in the mall and at the water park. It was everywhere. It was from Aerosmith, and it was from the soundtrack to the movie Armageddon, which was a fine movie for the 90s. It was actually one of 2 movies that summer that came out that were all about the end of the world. There was Armageddon and Deep Impact. And the plot of both movies was there was an asteroid on a collision course for Earth, and humanity has to figure out how to stop it. And in both movies, they fly these people up to space onto the asteroids to plant a bomb on them and explode it and try and knock the asteroid off course. And they mostly succeed in both movies. I can't recommend them, but there'll always be a place in my heart for Armageddon. It's a classic to me. But how many movies are there about the end of the world in some respect? Some natural disaster. There was like 2012, The Day After Tomorrow. How many post-apocalyptic movies are there about like zombies or something that happened? Or maybe you remember hearing about even War of the Worlds playing on the radio 90 years ago? How long ago is that? We have this fascination with the end. Like, how is it going to happen? When's it going to happen? And what's it going to be like? I saw on the news 2 weeks ago that China is hiring people for its planetary defense force because there's an asteroid on a course for Earth in the year 2032. They're hiring people to help plan for what happens. It's literally the plot of the movies, but in real life. And I saw last week that the chances of it hitting Earth have increased from 2% to 3%. So look out, 2032. I'm not sure what's going to happen. But can't you help but wonder sometimes, like, what's the end going to be like? What's going to happen? How do we survive an apocalypse? As we've said, we're in the book of Matthew this series, this month. We're digging into 5 sermons of Jesus in the book of Matthew. And this sermon today is his last public appearance before Holy Week, before he kind of heads toward the cross and the end of his life. And in this teaching, he's found himself in Jerusalem. Jesus is in the temple area, on the Temple Mount, and he's teaching the people, and he's having a discourse with the religious leaders, the Pharisees of the day. They've been testing him and pressuring him all day. When they're finally done testing him, Jesus kind of responds to them, and he actually calls out the Pharisees. We're going to read a lot of text today. I'm going to warn you up front. We've been reading a lot each week, but this is our heaviest lifting. And to help with our reading, we've enlisted volunteers, and today is no different. I'm going to ask Kyle to come forward. He's going to help me read. So you don't have to hear me read the whole thing all day long. But this first section of text is often called the 7 woes of the Pharisees, where he really tells the Pharisees what they've been doing wrong and how even over the course of years they failed to live up to their calling for Israel. He says that your ancestors let the people down, and you've completed their evil works by what you've done. As we kind of listen today, I encourage you to try and hear what he accuses the Pharisees of, what he's saying about them, what they're guilty of, and who he says they are. Kyle, would you read for us?
Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and his disciples. The legal experts and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, you must take care to do everything they say, but don't do what they do. For they tie together heavy packs that are impossible to carry. They put them on the shoulders of others, but are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do to be noticed by others. They make extra wide prayer bands for their arms and long tassels for their clothes. They love to sit in places of honor at banquets and in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with honor in the markets and to be addressed as rabbi. How terrible it will be for you legal experts and Pharisees, hypocrites. You shut people out of the kingdom of heaven. You don't enter yourselves, and you won't allow those who want to enter to do so. How terrible it will be for you legal experts and Pharisees, hypocrites. You give to God a tenth of mint, dill, and cumin, but you forget about the more important matters of the law, justice, peace, and faith. You ought to give a tenth, but without forgetting about those more important matters. You blind guides. You filter out an ant, but swallow a camel. How terrible it will be for you legal experts and Pharisees, hypocrites. You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. You say, if we had lived in our ancestors' days, we wouldn't have joined them in killing the prophets. You testify against yourselves that you are children of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead, complete what your ancestors did. You snakes, you children of snakes. How will you be able to escape the judgment of hell? Therefore, look, I'm sending you prophets, wise people, and legal experts. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some you will beat in your synagogues and chase from city to city. Therefore, upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been poured out on the earth, from the blood of that righteous man Abel to the blood of Zechariah and the son of Berechiah, whom you killed between the temple and the altar. I assure you that all these things will come upon this generation. Now Jesus left the temple and was going away. His disciples came to point out to him the temple buildings, and he responded, do you see all these things? I assure that no stone will be left on another. Everything will be demolished. Now, while Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately and said, tell us, when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?
Just brutal, right? Like, what's he saying to these Pharisees? So Matthew does this thing quite often where he'll start with a big public teaching from Jesus, like the Sermon on the Mount, or with the parable of the sower that Corey taught on 2 weeks ago. He'll bring his readers into a private moment with his people or his friends, his disciples. He'll go from the public to the private and then tell some parables to more explain, better elaborate on what he's trying to get at. And so as they're kind of walking away, Matthew takes us into this moment with the disciples. And the disciples I imagine they're kind of blown away by what just happened. He just threw down with the religious leaders, and they're a little blown back, and they're walking, not sure what to say. And they're like, Jesus, how about that temple, huh? That's cool. How about that? Those stones are sweet. And then Jesus is like, do you see all these things? I assure you, no stone will be left on another. Everything will be demolished. Then there's 2 questions the disciples ask. They say, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Jesus, tell us when the asteroid's going to hit. We would like to know. They think he has this crystal ball and can tell them all the answers. I mean, he is God, right? So keep those 2 questions in mind as you read this next section. Kyle?
Jesus replied, watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ. They will deceive many people. You will hear about wars and reports of wars. Don't be alarmed. These things must happen, but this isn't the end yet. Nations and kingdoms will fight against each other, and there will be famines and earthquakes in all sorts of places. But all these things are just the beginning of the sufferings associated with the end. They will arrest you, abuse you, and they will kill you. All nations will hate you on account of my name. At that time, many will fall away. They will betray each other and hate each other. Many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because disobedience will expand, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be delivered. The gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all the nations. Then the end will come. When you see the disgusting and destructive thing that Daniel talked about standing in the holy place, then those in Judea must escape to the mountains. Those on the roof shouldn't come down to grab things from their houses. Those in the field shouldn't come back to grab their clothes. How terrible it will be at that time for women who are pregnant and for women who are nursing their children. Pray that it doesn't happen in winter or on the Sabbath day. There will be great suffering such as the world has never been seen and will never see again. If that time weren't shortened, nobody would be rescued. But for the sake of the ones whom God chose, that time will be cut short. Now, immediately after the suffering of that time, the sun will become dark and the moon won't give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the planets and other heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then the sign of the human one will appear in the sky. At that time, all the tribes of the earth will be full of sadness, and they will see the human one coming in the heavenly clouds with power and great splendor. He will send his angels with the sound of a great trumpet, and they will gather his chosen ones from the four corners of the earth, from one end of the sky to the other.
So Jesus answered that second question first. What will be the signs of your coming and the end of the age? What's it going to be like? It's going to be chaotic. It's going to be hard. People will be ripped from families torn apart. There'll be famine and war and plague, and life is going to get really tough for a season. It's not a very pretty picture. There's actually a thing we're warned about often in the text is that in this world, we're going to have trouble. That's just how life is. Now, this text is all kinds of layers. And if you grew up in church, maybe you're familiar with it. Maybe you have a little bit of it's kind of PTSD right now, bringing you back to maybe some moments you've had as a child or throughout the 90s and 2000s with some great book series that were released. Maybe you're getting some flashbacks to those, and maybe there's some trauma that's being brought up right now. I have to warn you that while you might be thinking the end is nigh, the next text will get a little bit worse, but I promise you it'll eventually get better. It'll be better toward the end. There is some anxiety here. Can you feel it? In the disciples and their question, in the answer, this discomfort, it makes me feel uncomfortable to hear some of these words. And I'm wondering, should I be nervous or afraid? What's he saying to me? Does he have this crystal ball to predict the end times? Kyle, would you read this next section for us?
Learn this parable from the fig tree. After its branch becomes tender and it sprouts new leaves, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, you know that the human one is near at the door. I assure you that this generation won't pass away until all these things happen. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will certainly not pass away. But nobody knows when that day or hour will come, not even the heavenly angels and not the Son. Only the Father knows. As it was in the time of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the human one. In those days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark. They didn't know what was happening until the flood came and swept them all away. The coming of the human one will be like that. At that time, there will be two men in the field. One will be taken and the other left. Two women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and the other left. Therefore, stay alert. You don't know what day the Lord is coming, but you understand that if the head of the house knew at what time the thief would come, he would keep alert and wouldn't allow the thief to break into his house. Therefore, you also should be prepared, because the human one will come at a time you do not know.
So he answers the first question second. He's saying, when will these things happen? Before you get too excited, and before you think that I'm going to predict the end of the age, I want to give you a tool that's helpful for me and has really changed the way I approach a lot of the text. And we've talked about it before here, but it's so important to read the Bible in its own context. Before we ask what it means for us, we should ask what it meant for the original readers. And I want to tell you today that even though sometimes we're told the opposite of what I'm about to say, that it's just not true. And it's this: the Bible was not written to you. I'm sorry if you felt like that was true, but it was not written to you. The Bible was written for you and for me so that we would learn from it and grow from it and be challenged by it and hear God through it. But it was written to a different people in a different time, in a different context and culture than we live today, completely different. So when we read the words from the text, we need to ask first what it might have meant for them before we ask what it might mean for us today. And this specific text has been interpreted lots of different ways by lots of different people that are very, very smart. And they argue and disagree. But I'm going to share what I've gleaned from the text and what I believe that God wants to say to us today through it. I'm going to start by reading the Bible in its own context. Before I go back 2,000 years, I want to take us back 23 years. It was 2001. School had just started. I was walking through the halls of my high school, and I saw no one else other than Pastor Corey walking toward me in the hallway. And he had this look on his face, and I had no idea what he was going to say. And we're just walking through the hall. He comes to me and he says, "Someone just bombed the World Trade Centers." That moment changed the world forever. America, the West, the world was never the same. Could have never predicted or expected what would happen. That was a defining moment for our culture. Can you remember, think back to where you were when you first heard the news, if you were alive then? Remember what you might have felt that day, those feelings? I remember even in Canada, things felt like we were under attack. It was about more than just a building, right? It was a symbol. It was symbolic of an attack on the West or even freedom itself, it felt like. This was more than a building, but a moment, an attack on us. I'm hearing about planes being diverted and landing in neighboring airports near where I lived. Well, almost 2,000 years ago, the people of Jerusalem, the Jews, felt a similar thing. In the year 70 AD, there was a revolt in Jerusalem, an uprising. People were rebelling against Rome, their occupiers, their oppressors. They began to fight back against what was happening in Rome. And Emperor Titus comes into the city, and he squashes the rebellion. And he comes and he just lays the whole city flat and bare. People are taken away and torn one from another. People run for the hills. People are killed. People are brought away as slaves to other parts of the world. And most important of all, Emperor Titus flattens the temple. The temple was the center of their everything. It was the center of their religious life, the center of their economic life, the center of their cultural life. And this symbol for them, the destruction of the temple, changed everything. It's where they met God. And as they ran for the hills and watched the city burning and being destroyed behind them, anything we felt on September 11th might be a glimpse of what they felt as they watched their city fall in ruins. We're not sure when Matthew actually wrote the book Matthew, what we have the book of Matthew, but somewhere around 80 or 90 AD, 80, 90 CE, 20 years after the temple. So Jesus is telling this story in around the year 30. The temple falls in the year 70. Then Matthew writes these words in 80 or 90. As Jesus is walking away from the temple, what do you think he's imagining or picturing happening? As Matthew writes these words to his people, what's in his rearview mirror? What's in his mind thinking about these predictions? What do you think these words might mean for us today? It's tempting to look at these words and think they're predictive for our future. And they do speak to us into our future, but a couple of verses I want to point out this morning that I think are important before we move on. In Matthew 23:36, Jesus says, "I assure you that all these things will happen or come upon this generation." So I assure you that this generation won't pass away until all these things happen. And in 36, he says, but no one knows what day or hour, when the day or hour will come. Not the heavenly angels and not the Son, only the Father knows. Is the asteroid coming? Yes, it definitely is. But was there a crystal ball to predict the exact time? I don't think so. But I don't think Jesus needed a crystal ball. He could sense the culture and the conflict and what was happening in the world around him. He didn't need to predict some final apocalypse because he could sense the apocalypse coming in the next 30 or 40 years. And in 70 AD, as we saw people torn apart and families broken and war and rumors of war happening, Jesus' words were true then. They were also true in 150. They were true in 300 and 1500. They were true in 1914. They were true in 1939. And they are true today, and they'll be true in the future as we experience apocalypse after apocalypse. And I think what this text wants to suggest to us, and is consistent throughout the entire Bible, is that Jesus' concern isn't necessarily with the when or the what is going to happen. I think his concern for us is how are we going to live through those times, and who are we going to be in the midst of chaos and in the midst of apocalypse? How are we going to be formed, or what are his people going to be like? So Matthew, he starts in this public teaching, brings it to this private moment, then he explains with these parables like he often does. We're going to read one last passage, then jump into 3 parables of Jesus.
Who then are the faithful and wise servants whom their master puts in charge of giving food at the right time to those who live in his house? Happy are those servants whom the master finds fulfilling their responsibilities when he comes. I assure you that he will put them in charge of all his possessions. But suppose those bad servants should say to themselves, my master won't come until later. And suppose they began to beat their fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunks. The master of those servants will come on a day when they are not expecting him, at a time they couldn't predict. He will cut them in pieces and put them in a place with the hypocrites. People there will be weeping and grinding their teeth.
So Matthew tells 3 parables, 3 stories. A story about 10 bridesmaids, a story about the talents or the coins, and a story about the sheep and the goats. The first story is about 10 bridesmaids, or 10 girls, or 10 virgins, based on your translation. And these 10 bridesmaids are waiting for the groom to return. So they go out and they're waiting for them, and they bring these lanterns with them in case he arrives in the night. And the story says there's 5 wise bridesmaids and 5 foolish bridesmaids. And 5 of them bring extra oil, and they are the wise bridesmaids. And 5 don't bring extra oil, and they are the foolish bridesmaids. So they go out and they're waiting. They don't know how long until Jesus comes, or the groom comes back. I gave it away. How long until the groom comes back? And finally, in the middle of the night, they hear the groom is coming, and they get up from their sleep. And the 5 foolish bridesmaids, they say, quick, give us some of your oil. And the wise bridesmaids say, no, if we share, there won't be enough for us. Go buy some more. So they go off and they buy some oil. But meanwhile, the groom returns. And the wise bridesmaids, they go into the celebration with the groom, and they go into the party. And when the foolish ones finally get back, the doors are already closed, and it's too late. Now, if you're like me and you grew up reading this, maybe you thought something like, there's some people who get into heaven someday, and for others, it's going to be too late. It's this who's in and who's out. If that's your context or your tendency, like it has been mine, I want you to put that aside for a moment and ask, what did it mean for the original hearers? What's it about for them? What's it about for these disciples Jesus is talking to? I think the lesson here isn't about who's in or who's out. I think the lesson is about preparation. Are you prepared for the return of the groom? Think back to earlier that day, a couple hours before, Jesus talking to the Pharisees and the leaders. What's he say to them? You weren't ready for my coming. The groom is here. The Messiah who you've been waiting for has arrived. Who was prepared for Jesus' coming? Was it the religious people? People who had all the answers? Or was it the common folks who were ready to receive him, who had a soft and open heart to receive him when he came? It's a warning for Matthew's hearers. They're living in this new, scattered life after the fall of the temple. They have a taste of this life that they were warned about, this new reality when they've lost the core of who they are. And Matthew says, hard times have come and will come again. Are you prepared? Have you received the Messiah to walk through these times with you? What's our invitation? I think I would ask, are we going to be like the Pharisees who are closed off to receiving the groom when he comes? Or are we open and ready and prepared to receive the salvation of Jesus into our life when he shows up? As we're going through hard times, don't we want to go through them with the groom, with Jesus? Would we be prepared to receive the groom when he comes? It's not about preparing for some final event that's going to happen someday, but being prepared to receive the one who wants to walk through each event with us. It tells a story about a man, and this man has these 3 servants, and he gives them all these coins as he goes away. They're called talents in the story. And a talent is a denomination, like a quarter or a nickel, but a talent is worth 16 years' wages. It's an exorbitant amount of money. So going on this trip, and he gives the first servant he leaves behind, he gives him 5 talents. Say, here, take this. He gives the second man 2 talents. And he gives the third man 1 talent, and he goes away for a long period of time. We don't know how long, but it's quite a while. Finally, the man comes back, and the servants have to give an account of what they've done. And then the first servant says, Master, sir, I've taken your 5 coins, and I've made 5 more coins. I have 10 coins now, 10 talents. And the master says, good job, you're a faithful servant. You've been faithful with a little. I'm going to give you a lot. My son, he's 2.5. He's obsessed with a lot. All he wants is lot. Daddy, I want lot. I want lot. And the master says, I'm going to give you lot. I'm going to give you lot. And the second guy says, Master, sir, I had 2 coins and I made 2 more. I have 4 coins now. And the master says, you've been faithful with a little bit. I'm going to give you lot as well. And finally, the last man says, sir, I know you're a hard man. You harvest where you don't sow. You make money where you don't even invest. So I was afraid and I buried my coin in the ground. And the man says, you're a wicked and lazy servant. Why didn't you at least put the money in the bank where it could gain some interest? Get out of here. You're being tossed out and your coin being given to the man who has now 10 coins. What's the invitation to the original hearers that day? I think it's a warning to be good stewards with what they've been given. Are they going to steward what they have well, not financially, but the responsibility that they've been entrusted with? The Jewish people, Israel, was God's people, tasked with being a blessing to the rest of the world. An opportunity to put God, their God, on display for all to see. And what did Jesus say to the Pharisees that day on the Temple Mount? He says, you've squandered what you've been given. Instead of making it easier for those to get into the kingdom, you've made it harder. You've been given this amazing gift, and you haven't stewarded it well. As Matthew's hearers are hearing this 50 years later, they're reminded, looking back, are we going to steward our life now well here? Or are we going to live like our previous fathers did that led to the destruction of the temple? How about for us today? What's our invitation? Well, first of all, I want to reiterate the abundance in this parable. The amount that the man gives his servants is incredible. It's so much money. It'd be like giving someone millions of dollars today. There's so much abundance. And we've all been given these gifts and these talents and abilities and personality. And this abundance has been lavished onto us. It's inside of us. You are so incredibly valuable. And your gifts are waiting for you to just receive them and live into them. So you accept that invitation today. A couple things I want to point out is that as he tells this story, the expectation isn't the same for each person. The person with 2 coins isn't required to make 5 coins. The person with 1 not required to make 2 or 5. It's just to steward well whatever it is you have. And actually, the bar is set pretty low for the last guy. The man says, why didn't you at least put it in the bank? Like, do something. Whatever you do, just don't do nothing. Like, do anything with what you've been given. That's all I ask. And if you do, you'll receive more and more. You'll be entrusted with more and more. As we wait for what's next, as we look to whatever might come in this season of preparation, will we steward this time well? The last story he tells is one of the more famous parables. If you've been around church, you've probably heard it. But again, reading in context, what questions is Jesus answering? He's saying, when will these things happen? When's it going to happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? But how is he answering them? Not with the when or the what, but the how and the who are we going to be? And the story goes like this. One day a king will sit on his throne, and he'll gather all the nations before him, and he'll separate them on his left and on his right, like a shepherd separates sheep and goats. To those on his right, he'll say, good job, you're welcomed into my kingdom and your inheritance. For when I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me a drink. When I was a stranger, you welcomed me in. When I was sick, you tended to me. When I was in prison, you visited me. And those on his right will say, when did we do these things for you? When did this happen? And the king says, whenever you did it for the least of my brothers and sisters, you did it for me. And he looks at those on his left and he says, be gone from me into the fire. For when I was hungry, you didn't feed me. When I was thirsty, I had nothing to drink. When I was sick, you didn't take care of me. When I was a stranger, you didn't welcome me in. When I was in prison, you didn't visit me. And they're like, when didn't we do these things? Like, if we had known, we would have, obviously. And he says, whenever you didn't do it for the least of these, you didn't do it for me. Again, the story isn't necessarily about like who's in or who's out or passing some test or living to a perfect standard. I think it's actually the exact opposite of that. You think about the religious leaders of the day, the Pharisees, they lived to the perfect standard in their mind. Remember what Kyle read for us? He said, you give God 1/10 of your mint and dill and cumin, these tiny spices. Like they weigh out 1/10 of each thing. They're so perfect in these little elements of following the law. But you forget the important things like justice and peace and faith. The people listening to Jesus earlier that day would have been as surprised as the sheep and the goats. You mean the ones who are supposed to have all the answers, the ones who know all the rules and the laws, they're not living the right way? And the sheep and goats are just as surprised. You can follow all the rules technically, but if your heart isn't in the right place, it doesn't matter. Because in the story, both groups are surprised. The Pharisees, or the goats who think they're living well, are surprised to find out they've been living poorly. And the sheep who have been living properly don't even realize it. They're unaware they've been doing the right things because it's just who they are. They've been formed and shaped and prepared in a way that's a natural expression of how they are. It's how they live it out. The invitation for the people isn't to perform, but to be formed. To be formed into a kind of person that naturally does these things. What's the biggest criticism of the Pharisees of that day? So they were hypocrites. We tend to think of hypocrites as being like someone who says one thing and does another thing. But literally, the word hypocrite means the word like actor or someone who wears a mask. The Pharisees knew how to perform, but they had no formation. They could pretend to do the right things, but they weren't shaped in a way that it was a natural part of who they were. They knew how to act the part, put on a performance, but they had no formation at all. For Matthew's hearers, a few years later, they've seen this suffering, they've seen what's happening, and they're asked, are we taking care of our brothers and sisters in the midst of this? How about for us today, a couple thousand years later? I think for us, a prayer is a good start, maybe. Saying, God, would you form me? Would you shape me so that when I act in ways that looks like how you'd hope, taking care of those around me, that I don't even realize I'm doing a good job. I'm just living out how I've been made, how you've been molding me and creating me, that I would no longer need to perform, but I would be formed because of how you've been influencing me and helping me and growing me and chiseling at me. Listen, the world around us is freaking out. When we're worried about the asteroid coming or the end of the age or what's next or whatever is trying to be predicted through all the crystal balls out there, when you're reading the things on social media or in the newspaper and wondering what's going to happen, our invitation is to move away from the what or the when, but begin to ask ourselves, what about the how? How are we going to go through these things? And who are we going to be in the middle of these hard times? Our concern is not about predicting, but about preparation. It's about owning our own gifts, some responsibility and stewardship there, the abundance we've been given so much. And it's being formed in a way that as we go through this life, we take care of those around us and walk with them and carry them along with us on the way. Would you pray with me today? God, would you form us like I just mentioned? Help us to be the kind of people that are shaped by you, that are ready to be prepared, ready to welcome you into our life, the deepest and the hardest areas of our life, that we would be open to receive you, that we would be shaped and formed. We'd steward what we've been given, the abundant blessings you've given us. We steward that well. And that we would take care of our brothers and sisters along the way, through and in the middle of the hard times or the apocalypse. Amen.